Is the trial and the acquittal of this armed officer a sign that our justice system works, or a disgrace which could undermine public safety? Let's speak to Chris Daw KC, criminal barrister at Millennium Chambers, who's the author of the book Justice on Trial. Chris, what should we learn from this case?
We should learn that the persecution of police officers by the power of the state prosecution agency and all the powers that go with that responsibility against someone who is putting his life on the line for us every second of every shift is a catastrophic waste of resource, and it's a deeply, deeply damaging thing to do. And I think perhaps it's worth reflecting on something, because what we're talking about here is split-second decision-making by an officer in the field, on the ground. Police officers, and I've represented many police officers in over the years in my practice, police officers who are convicted of crimes such as murder and sent to prison, they don't have the experience of prison that most other people do. They are treated basically as sex offenders, and they are put on a wing with sex offenders for their own protection. That's what happens to police officers who go to prison. And this prosecution would have resulted, if it had been successful, in this firearms officer going to prison for life in those conditions, as I've just described. Now, I want us to rewind to that split second when that officer had to make the instinctive decision as to whether to open fire or not. And if in the back of his mind is, the decision that I make every time I pull the trigger could leave me in prison for 30 years, facing all of the consequences and the horror that would entail, who would pull a trigger, Iain? Who would ever pull the trigger?
Well, I totally agree with you. But should this police officer have been named? Because it was opened, presumably, to the judge to not name him.
No, I don't. Excuse me, I don't think he should have been named. And I don't think any officer in this situation should be named, because it's the same principle. If the officer in the moment is thinking to himself...
Chris, I'm going to let you cough, because I can tell your voice is about to go. So hopefully that's given you a little chance to have a little sip of water.
No, that's very kind. That's very kind, Iain. And the answer I was giving was no, he shouldn't have been named. It's the same exact proposition that anyone needs to think about, is that split second before the trigger is pulled. If I could be named and shamed and put at direct personal physical risk of being attacked, or my family being attacked by gangsters or people who are in the habit of carrying weapons, who would pick up the gun? Who would ever do it? And we've already seen it, even at the point of charge in this case, that many, many officers handed back their firearm certificate and handed back their weapons and said, I'm not going to carry live weapons anymore. The streets of London depend, above almost any other policing function, upon the armed response unit for our security and our safety.
Do you think the Crown Prosecution Service were motivated by perhaps an understandable motivation, because it was a white police officer shooting a black person? And we all know the consequences of that in the past. The CPS may have decided, well, we have to, this has to go to court, because if it doesn't, there could be some very potentially unfortunate consequences from that.
Well, the CPS isn't a PR agency. The CPS is there to carry out its legal and statutory function, which is to assess a case by two criteria when they decide whether to prosecute or not. The first is whether there is sufficient evidence for a jury to convict. In other words, whether it's more likely than not that the person will be convicted on the evidence available. And so that's point number one. That's called the evidential test. The second test, and this is a very important, equally important test, is whether it is in the public interest to bring the prosecution. Now, in this case, I wasn't privy to all of the evidence, and none of us are. So how the decision was made that the case was more likely than not to result in a conviction, none of us can say. But what shouldn't have happened, Iain, is that anybody was taking account of any of the things that you described in your question, because none of those things have anything to do with the application of that very strict statutory process. But moving on from whether there was evidence or not that this could be murder, and frankly, having seen the public domain evidence, I'm sceptical as to what that may have been. But moving on from that, the public interest in prosecuting an officer for what was clearly what worse, a marginal error of judgment in a split-second situation. How does the public interest sit with such a prosecution, which leads directly to the resignation of many, many firearms officers, and which may well lead to the resignation of many more from the stories that have been in the media today? How, on any rational basis, and even if you didn't know about Kaba's background, which is frankly irrelevant in the split second, none of that was in the officer's mind when he opened fire. He didn't know anything about the stuff that we've now found out. So it's interesting and it's important context, but it's not actually relevant to the issue of the shooting. And on the shooting, my view is that no officer in that impossibly difficult, how many of us can even imagine deciding whether to shoot someone to kill them or not? I mean, how many of us? There are a few hundred people in this country, or a few thousand, including the military, who have ever had to do that. And here we are standing in judgment and putting them through the risk of a murder conviction. It's amazing to me that there are any firearms officers left, and that's testament only to their commitment to public safety and to the duty that they bring to their job every single day. But it's not because of the way that firearms officers are being treated by the criminal justice system.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. That's Chris Daw KC.